Good morning and welcome to the Justice Committee's 22nd meeting of 2019. There are no apologies, but both Liam MacArthur and Liam Kerr will be with us a little later. Travel problems. Agenda item 1 is declaration of interest, and I'm pleased to welcome James Kelly to the committee. James, do you have any relevant interest to declare?
Thank you, Convener. Can I declare that my brother Tony Kelly is a sheriff within the sheriffdom of Glasgow and Strathkelvin?
Thank you. Agenda item 2 is a decision on whether to take items 8 and 9 in private, which are to consider our approach to the Children's Scotland Bill and to consider our work programme. Are we all agreed? Agreed, thank you. Agenda item 3 is consideration of an affirmative instrument, which is the Scottish Tribunals Listed Tribunals Regulations 2019 draft, and I welcome Ash Denham, Minister for Community Safety and her officials, Lorlyn Keller, Courts and Tribunals Policy Officer, and Heather McClure, lawyer with the Scottish Government. I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk. And Minister, I believe you want to make a short opening statement.
Yes, please. Thank you, Convener. These are the Scottish Tribunals Listed Tribunals Regulations 2019. As you'll see, they're relatively straightforward regulations which amend the Tribunals Scotland Act of 2014 to include a bus lane adjudicator in the list of tribunals whose functions may be transferred to the Scottish tribunals under that Act. The Act created a new, simplified statutory framework for tribunals in Scotland by establishing the Scottish Tribunals, which brings existing tribunals legislation together and provides a structure for new jurisdictions. Schedule 1 of the Act sets out those bodies which may transfer into the first-tier tribunal, and whilst the parking adjudicators are listed in that section, the bus lane adjudicators are not. In addition to their parking appeal functions, the current 4 parking adjudicators also undertake functions in relation to bus lane contravention appeals. So this amendment supports the policy intention that the functions of the bus lane adjudicators will be transferred into the first-tier tribunal for Scotland at the same time as those of the parking adjudicators. I understand that the DPLRC considered these regulations on the 3rd of September and that no points were raised by them, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee has on these.
Members have any questions on this? No questions. That being the case, agenda item 4 is formal consideration of the motion in relation to the affirmative instrument. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, as the Minister says, has considered and reported on the instrument and had no comment on it. The motion will be moved with an opportunity for formal debate if necessary. The motion is motion 18220. That the Justice Committee recommends that the Scottish Tribunal Listed Tribunals Regulations 2019 draft be approved. Minister, to move and... Moved. Yeah, I take it you don't want to say anything further, Minister? No. Do members have anything they want to say in relation to this? Yeah, not the most riveting of all subordinate legislation we've looked at. Right, that being the case, then the question is that motion 18220 in the name of Ash Denham be approved. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. That concludes our consideration of the affirmative instrument. The committee's report will note and confirm the outcome of the debate. Is the committee agreed to delegate their authority to me as convener to clear the final draft of the report? Agreed. Agreed, thank you. Minister, I thank you and your officials for attending, and I suspend briefly to allow for a change of witnesses. Item 5 is pre-budget scrutiny, and this is an evidence session on the pre-budget scrutiny of the Scottish Government's 2020-2021 budget. The focus of the committee's scrutiny this year is mainly on the prison service budget, as well as budgets provided to the public, third and voluntary sectors for services to prisoners. I refer members to paper 2, which is a paper by the clerk, and paper 3, which is a private paper. We will hear from 2 panels of witnesses this morning, and I welcome the witnesses for our first panel: Stephen Sandham, Deputy Chief Inspector of Prisons, HM Inspectorate of Prisons Scotland, and Phil Fairley, Scottish National Chairman, Prison Officers Association Scotland. We'll go straight to questions from members, starting with John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to ask you about the implications of the level of prisoners that there are on the estate, over 8,000 in 2019-20. And what implications that has for the safety and well-being not only of the staff there, but also the inmates and the relationship, and how it will impact jointly that level of occupancy.
Shall I kick off on that one? So, yeah, absolutely. From the Inspectorate's point of view, we're extremely concerned by the really dramatic rise in the prison population that you refer to there. So the population has increased by over 700 in the last 12 months, which is equivalent to a large prison in its own right, and by about over 1,000 prisoners in the last 16 months. So it's gone up from 7,200 in April 2018 to 8,300 approximately now. And that's way beyond the planned design capacity of the prison service. So the planned design capacity is round about 7-8. So you're talking about over 500 more prisoners having to be accommodated within the prison service than is normally the case. That's really having quite a dramatic impact, in our view, on the safety of prisoners, but also, as you say, the safety of prison officers as well. It's having an impact on the ability of the Scottish Prison Service to provide what we would call a kind of normal regime. Simple things like you've got a lot more prisoners requiring medication, so the whole process of dispensing medication is taking longer than it previously did. That's impacting on the ability of prison officers to get people to where they should be, both the work sheds and other purposeful activity. And so we're seeing a range of kind of performance indicators that are going in the wrong direction, and that was highlighted in the Audit Scotland Section 22 report that was published last week. So we think it's got quite a profound and quite worrying impact.
Mr. Fairley, maybe touch on the issue of purposeful activity and the ability or lack thereof to rehabilitate caused by these numbers. But can you comment on the safety issue, both for your members and for the prison population, please?
Yeah, I mean, from the prison officer's point of view, I think the details that we would want you to focus on are the violence levels going up inside prisons, both on staff and on prisoners. Whether there's serious assaults or the common assaults, both of those numbers have gone up substantially. That's not just because of the growth in the prisoner population, which we would assume might add to those numbers. That's not the full explanation for it. There's lots going on in terms of the climate, the environment in which staff are being asked to work and prisoners are being held in. And the sick absence levels themselves, I think, are a very significant factor in terms of describing what the impact is of the overcrowding on the staff inside the prisons. That in itself, in terms of the health and welfare of the staff inside the prisons, is reflected heavily in those numbers. 60% of an increase in the sick absence levels tell you quite significantly what's going on in terms of staff's ability to cope inside the environment. So between that and the violence figures, I think they're two very clear, stark indicators of what's going on inside the prison.
And are you able to say, I appreciate it's not a straightforward issue, but are you able to say that, I mean, obviously these issues will be compounded by the officer numbers, by the prison numbers, but to what extent does that impact, with, for instance, levels of violence and safety for your members?
Well, the serious assaults have doubled. Quite obviously, the serious assaults are the ones that give most concern. So the numbers that we've had of serious assaults have doubled, but the numbers of assaults at all have also doubled, and that's staff and prisoners. And some of that's to do with what Stephen touched on earlier in terms of what the day has been taken up with, simply by the volume of prisoners we've got. We've got staff who are going through just the daily process in terms of feeding, medication, exercise, in and out to work sheds. All of that takes much more time of the staff up being engaged in that process instead of dealing with some of the purposeful activity stuff or the challenge and offending behaviour stuff that we would normally be doing. So all of that has an impact on the day-to-day climate inside our prisons. I think another complication or a factor that's added into the numbers issue is the increased use of psychoactive substances. That itself is having an enormous impact on the climate inside the prisons. It's completely unpredictable. It's never the same 2 days in a row. The prisoners themselves have no clue what reaction they're going to get when they take this stuff, and neither do the staff. So the tried and tested means that we've got as prison officers for dealing with violent or disturbing incidents inside a prison, when you're dealing with psychoactive substances, in a lot of cases, exactly the wrong thing to do. And I think through time, we've managed to identify some of the things that we do that aren't particularly helpful at that time. What's missing at this stage is what we can do in its place. There's nothing that we've got that's the alternative to that in terms of managing those incidents safely. So that in itself can contribute to either staff or prisoner injuries during those incidents.
Thank you. Mr Sandon, can you comment on this term purposeful activity and the capacity that Scottish Prison Service has to respond by providing more of that, if indeed that's possible, given the increase in numbers?
Yeah. So the Section 22 report that Audit Scotland laid last Thursday on the 12th of September laid out that the number of purposeful activities, which is kind of sending people either to work sheds, sending them to education, anything that gets them out of the cell and doing something that is helpful in terms of rehabilitation and in terms of giving social interaction with fellow prisoners, has reduced by about 500,000. So in 2016-17, there was 6,758,000 hours of purposeful activity, and that's gone down to 6,258,000. So it's a drop of 500,000, which is quite significant, and that means the average numbers of purposeful activity per week per convicted prisoner has dropped from 22 to 20 hours. But I would also highlight the fact that we, for a long time in HMIPS, have been concerned that not enough is done for remand prisoners. So remand prisoners get very much less purposeful activity than that. And that's, we think, a concern because it leaves them in their own cells for much longer than we think is desirable for their mental health.
The committee did a report on remand that you're perhaps cited on. I wonder then, that 22 to 20, what's the explanation for that? Is it all the other activities of the prison that's been alluded to?
It's also, as Phil was alluding to, the sick absence. So as Phil was saying, that sick absence has gone up quite dramatically, and you know, they've lost the equivalent of 14,000 man days due to stress. The average sick level has gone up from 16.3 days gone up by 60% to 16.3 days, and up to 17 days by July 2019. So that means that they're running with effectively a shortage of staff. I spoke to the SBS last week, and they were suggesting that they were kind of equivalent to 50 people down just because of the additional sick leave. They're about 60 down in terms of what they would need to cover the additional prisoner numbers, and they've got about 100 staff who, for various reasons, they can't employ. Either they're on maternity leave or on phased returns to work. So that gets you up to about 200 staff down on what they would need in their own workforce modelling to provide the kind of regime that they would wish to be able to do.
A final comment, Mr Fairley, about...
On top of that, you'd simply with the fact that we've got more prisoners inside our prisons, you would think the number of hours being delivered would go up, not down, because there are more people who are required to be given access to the purposeful activity. The explanation that Stephen's given is an explanation as to why not, but it's not the only explanation. Actually, having that number of extra prisoners inside the system, the 20 going down to 22, is as much about capacity to deliver. Even if all those staff who weren't off absent and were in their place of work, there's been no subsequent growth in the staff complements for prisons with the prison numbers. So even if we brought in 700 prisoners and everybody was at work, you've got no extra capacity to deliver the numbers we need to deliver for the purposeful activities. There's no growth in the staff that matches the growth in the prisoner numbers.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Jenny, supplementary.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Just as a kind of supplementary to John Finney's line of questioning, in terms, Stephen Sandham, of the reduction in purposeful activity, you spoke about a reduction of, was it £500,000, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. And do you know what percentage of that has been linked to educational opportunities specifically, or is it not measured individually?
It's not. Well, I don't have those stats. It will be measured, but I don't have those stats available to me, but I could try and get them to you.
And in terms of the educational opportunities that are available across the prison estate, would you say there is an equal opportunity for, you know, all inmates to access that? We've spoken about remand prisoners this morning. Is there a variation at the moment nationally?
I think so. So there's definitely, I think, a disparity between the amount of opportunities for convicted prisoners and remands, and I can't highlight that enough, that whilst I've no doubt that the SBS colleagues do encourage remands to access these opportunities, we think they could be more proactive about that. In a sense, I think they ask them, and if they say no, then that kind of suits them in a way. So we would like them to be more proactive in encouraging remands to take up those opportunities. But it's the SPS is very much measured against its amount of activity it provides for convicted prisoners rather than what it does for remands. So there will be quite a sharp distinction, I suspect, in the stats.
Mr Fairley?
I think education will fall into the same territory as any other purposeful activities. We've got a national contract for education, but that's only part of what you need to give regular access to that to all. So it will vary across from establishment to establishment. There'll be several reasons as to why different establishments deal with it in a different way, but it will be variable from site to site.
Thank you.
Fulton supplementary, and then Liam Kerrs.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. It's just a very quick supplementary. You both said there in response to John Finney's, particularly yourself, Phil Fairley, about the increase in assaults on staff and on other prisoners, and that's very worrying, to say the least. Do you have any idea of the stats of that? Is it general across the board? Is it a uniform increase, or is it in certain prisons that you're seeing a larger increase in those incidents, and therefore is there an argument for resources for certain prisons, or is it just a uniform?
I missed the last part.
Is it just a uniform situation across the whole prison estate?
Yes, it's not. There's not a specific group or specific prisons that you would single out as being that being the area where there's a problem. It is across the estate. It's just a general increase in either minor or serious assaults on staff and prisoners right across. So it's not that you could zone in and identify either one site or one group of prisoners to which those numbers apply.
Okay.
Yeah.
Point, if I may, is there any analysis being done on, because what we've seen is, to go to Jenny Gilruth's point about the remand prisoners, so we've seen a big increase in the number of prisoners on remand. Anecdotally, I understand that they can have some of the most challenging behaviours just because of the situation they're in. So is there any analysis being done on whether the increase in staff assaults, the increase in prisoner assaults, is a function of more remand prisoners? Is it that population that's driving it, or is that analysis, or does that not bear out, or is that analysis not being done?
I don't know if the analysis is being done. I certainly haven't had sight of any analysis that would drill down to that. I have to say, from my own membership feedback to that, it wouldn't be focused on remand alone. It's not that group itself is where the violence is centred or focused. That's not my understanding from the members, and the information we get given of assaults that take place, they come from a much wider prisoner group than that. But I don't know if there's an analysis getting done on it. I've got no sight of it.
I wonder if I could...
Sorry. I don't have analysis on that either. But I would tend to concur with Phil that it won't be predominantly based on remands. It will be across the board, potentially more in convicted than remands, but I don't know.
I wonder if I could maybe just clarify. You said that a lot of the purposeful activity, the education work is contracted out. Now, if you have these staff shortages and this isn't taking place, what happens in terms of the contract? Does it still go ahead and outside agencies are being paid for work that isn't undertaken? Is there any clause to mitigate that?
So I think that does happen. I think we've seen evidence of certainly facilities, library facilities, for instance, being available and difficulties getting prisoners to the library. We've, I think, seen evidence in inspections of the same thing happening both with education and with the work sheds as well, that fewer people get there than they would wish. So there's a number of people that prisoners that are expecting to turn up, and not all of them turn up for various reasons. Some of them are kind of completely legitimate, and some linked to just difficulties of managing the amount of numbers in the system at present.
So is there any purposeful activity in this situation going on in prisons when you're so desperately down in numbers?
I mean, I think there's no question that part of the reason for those numbers being down is that the staff who are qualified to deliver some of those purposeful activities to the prisoner population have been taken off their posts to supplement and assist the staff in the residential areas simply because of staff shortages. We've got staff who are supposed to be contracted 8 to 5, 9 to 5 during the week to provide those purposeful activities, who are coming off that onto shift work to work inside the residential areas to assist simply because of the numbers.
What about the outside agencies? Because there's a contract, is there not sometimes, whether that's with mentoring or counselling with outside agencies? Are they still coming into the prison? Are they able to do the job they were contracted to do?
So they are still coming into the prison, and they're still doing the best job they possibly can. I think it's not a criticism of them at all. And let's be clear that the Section 22 report that was published last week did show that the number of vocational and employment-related qualifications had actually gone up between 2016-17 and 2018-19 by about 6,000, but the converse of that was the number of vocational and employment-related qualifications above SCQF level 5 had dropped from 2,465 to 1,781. So it's a kind of mixed picture. There's more people getting qualifications, but fewer at the higher level of qualification being
If I can be quite clear, it's absolutely no criticism of the people that are contracted, prepared, ready
Absolutely.
to do the job and have been paid to do the job. We're looking at pre-budget scrutiny, how money is used effectively, and it doesn't seem to me that this has been looked at in any shape or form. I mean, is there a clause whereas there may be times when, for various reasons, so that you can bring these people, use that resource again, to have increased hours? Is that anything that's been looked at, to make up for the hours lost because of exceptional absences, sicknesses, any of that?
You would need, sorry, I don't want to fudge the question, but you would need to put that to the Scottish Prison Service themselves. We, as HMIPS, we don't have access to that information. Our focus is very much on the conditions and treatment of prisoners rather than on the performance, as it were, of SPS itself in how it manages its budget. And that's more where Audit Scotland come in their scrutiny. But I'm sure the SPS could provide you with information on that.
Did you refer, Mr Sandon, to the Auditor General's report of 2018-19?
I was referring to the Audit Scotland Section 22 report that was published last week on the 12th of September.
Mr Fairley, would you have a comment on that then?
Yeah, I think in terms of the purposeful activity that I'm referring to, I'm talking about the ones that is provided and delivered by prison staff rather than the contractors. So I'm not aware that the education contract isn't being met by the education providers. The variable bit that I'm referring to, I think, is across sites in terms of our ability to provide the prisoner population to the education service rather than the other way around.
Well, can I put it to you then, is there a case for getting more outside agencies who will have the manpower into prisons so that prisoners are doing, prison officers are doing the core work and ensuring they're doing core work, which I realise sometimes is taking on purposeful activity, but if you can guarantee that an outside agent, a third sector organisation or a voluntary organisation that's working in the prison will be there, will be taking up some of the slack, then the logistic is only to get them to meet with these people who are contracted to do the work.
Yeah, I think the staff who are tasked with providing the purposeful activity inside the prisons, the fact that they're not doing that, it's not down to them, it's down to the prison system not having enough prison officers on the front line in the residential areas. So they've been taken off the role that they're trained to do to provide a different role. What we need ultimately is more prison officers. And that would free up those staff who are trained to do the purposeful activity to go back to deliver that. I think the outside agencies are certainly an option that you might want to consider, but I think if you look at any Chief Inspector's reports up to date and in past, one of the things that they focus on very heavily is the value of that relationship between prison staff and the prisoners and the impact that has on the day-to-day delivery and the routine inside the prison. So prison officers delivering those purposeful activities is something that the prisoner population value very much. So I think for me it's more about providing more prison officers to the front line in the residential area rather than taking them off the purposeful activity route.
Right, referring to the Auditor General's report 2018-19, then she says that Scottish Prison Service within it, the main findings say the service faces a combination of severe pressure on many fronts, and this poses a threat to operational safety, effectiveness and financial sustainability. So, given that, first of all, if there were more resources, and it is the case they've fallen in real terms in recent years, would there be prison officers available? Because I seem to recall that we heard from, I can't remember, head of prisons, that there was a difficulty about recruiting prison officers. So I'm trying to tease down what is the nature of the problem precisely, given the financial sustainability comment that's been raised in the Auditor General's report.
So, I mean, in terms of recruitment, the biggest problem we've got recruitment-wise is up in Grampian, and it's been a problem from the day that the Grampian prison opened. We've always had a difficulty in terms of getting proper staff and complement into that prison. But it's not just in Grampian, we're seeing that right across the country. I think from a trade union perspective, I would argue that part of the background to that is that the prison service, for an awful lot of people now, in terms of the salary scales and the attractiveness of it, it's seen more as a job than a career. We've got an awful lot of people, Grampian's a perfect example of who, we've got staff who are working in the prison service as a secondary income to the family home. They're not seeing it as a career, and the turnover rate there is much higher than anywhere else, but it's not only in Grampian. That does exist in other parts of the country. I think we've just gone through a very successful pay round with the Scottish Government and the Chief Executive of the Prison Service, which I think will help. The pay deal we've got makes us a far more attractive organisation and employer. But I genuinely think that part of the problem has been that the prison service and the terms and conditions and the environment in which you've been asked to work for that reward, for an awful lot of people, just wasn't attractive.
And I think it was Colin McConnell, CEO of the Scottish Prison, that suggested this was a general problem, not just to Grampian, but across the prison estate. And given what you said about the safety, operational safety, is it purely just a case of the salaries that are being awarded, or is it the nature of the job and the dangers faced from active substances, etc., to the attacks on prisoners that's making this a less attractive job to even for anyone to consider, regardless of the salary?
No, I think the kind of media coverage that we've had probably in the last year, maybe more so in the last 6 months, highlighting the issues that are going on inside a prison. If you're somebody outside and looking for a career change, in terms of what you're seeing and reading about inside the prisons, that doesn't look like a particularly attractive career move, no matter what the salary is. But I hope that's not going to be the headlines and the talking points and the media coverage that we're going to continue to have, and that we'll be able to do something to improve the conditions and the environment inside our prisons, so that's no longer the talking point. I think in terms of the pay deal we've just done, we've made it a more attractive employer salary-wise. The real test will come once people start to look at this as a career move out with the headlines that are running just at the moment, which is all about overcrowding, increase in violence, huge sick absence levels, and a particularly unattractive environment for people to come and work in just now.
So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. James, supplementary. Oh, sorry. No, James, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask about the issue of through care, which was suspended in July of this year. Can you maybe give us an idea of the impact that suspension has had on, prison staff and prisoners, and also in partner organisations? Obviously, through care is very important in terms of supporting prisoners as they move from prison into the community and ensuring that they have some kind of stability as they get, as they're released from prison.
So certainly from the Inspectorate's point of view, we're very disappointed to see the loss of the through care services. We consistently, when we go on and inspect, we find them to be one of the most positive bits of activity done in the prison, and one of the most valuable services provided. We fully understand that. I think the Chief Executive of the SPS felt he needed to pull his only option to deal with the situation of the overcrowding, which we've already talked about, was to pull those trained officers back, because he needed more trained officers on the residential areas. My understanding was that Scottish Government offered further money if it was a money issue, and it was not a money issue. It was the need to get trained bodies back into the residential areas. But you're absolutely right that through care provides a hugely important service. There was an evaluation done, I think in 2017, which was very positive about its potential impact in reducing reoffending. My understanding is that they've made kind of transitional arrangements for organisations to pick up some of the work that was done by the through care officers, but I think it's certainly very, very unfortunate that it's happened, and we note that it is only a temporary measure by the SPS, and we hope that the through care services will be come back in as soon as possible.
Yeah, from the trade union point of view, we agreed with the Chief Executive at the time to withdraw the through care officers and come back in to the prison and give support to the residential staff. But that's not because we don't value that role as much as anybody else does. It is a hugely successful venture that the prison service took on, and if you don't mind, I'm going to claim some of the credit from the POA point of view, because it was us that was pushing to get prison officers. The skills and knowledge that we've got in working with the client group that we're talking about was always something that had the potential to go beyond the walls of prison and help for that transition back into the community. So the through care role is something that we value very much. The staff that who've provided that role are deeply disappointed to be back inside the prison, because they get so much back from it, as did the client group that they were working with. So we've supported it on the basis that it's temporary. We absolutely want to see it back and reinstated, because I think the report that Stephen's referring to was 78% success rate in terms of the impact on reoffending and people coming back into prison in the first 2 years. So that's not something that we should give up lightly, and we should reinvest to make sure that it can come back. But from a trade union point of view, it was the right decision at the right time. We can't allow staff who can contribute to protecting the health and well-being of staff inside the prisons to sit outside that and leave that at risk. So the priority for us had to be making sure that the staff inside the prisons, with the numbers we're dealing with, were given the support they needed to manage with that. But I really hope that it is only going to be a temporary measure and that role will be back up and running soon. It's too valuable to lose.
You're both right to point out how valuable the service is, particularly in terms of reducing reoffending, which is something that's very important, obviously. In terms of this temporary suspension, has there been any indication given from either the prison service or the government as to the timeline that this suspension is going to be operating for? Have we got any indication yet as to when it will be reintroduced?
There's not a timeline on it, but I think that's because we don't know how long we're going to be dealing with overcrowding or how long we're going to be dealing with the growth in sick absence levels within the prison service. We're going through a review just now with the employer in terms of how we manage sick absence in the service, and actually those conversations are going very well. They're positive, and I think between us we're going to come up with something that can have a significant impact on those numbers. But until those numbers start to change, we couldn't tell you what the timescale is going to be for it.
So it's open-ended at this point, really?
Yeah.
Shona, was it a supplementary? Yes.
It was. I'm very interested to hear that what you're saying about it not being a money issue, because I think sometimes this issue has been portrayed as such, and it's far more complex than that. It would be interested to hear, if you're able to give this, how many officers we're talking about here that have been redeployed from through care back into the prison estate. Do you have that figure?
There was 42 through care officers, and all 42 were taken off that service and brought back in.
Has there been an impact of sickness absence, particularly on that group of people, or not particularly any different from?
I couldn't tell you, to be honest. I haven't drilled down into it.
And the solution, presumably, is there any temporary solutions that could be brought to bear to try to mitigate, or is it really a case of solving the wider prison estate issues to enable those officers, as you say, highly trained, to go back into through care?
They could make an operational decision to put them back into the through care role. That's an option that's open to them. From the trade union point of view, we would want to know what mitigating steps then they're going to take to give the assistance that those 42 staff are given to the frontline staff inside the prisons. We need to know what else is available to us then to give the support and the protection that those staff need. So it's purely an operational decision. They could choose to put them back into the role, and I could live with that, quite honestly, if we had an alternative to providing the support that the staff need inside the halls.
I think it comes back to the point we discussed earlier, that the prison service is geared, or its funding and its operational capacity was geared around a prison population of 7,800, and you've got 8,300, so you've got 500 extra people in there, and they don't have the additional staff to deal with that.
Okay, thank you.
I think you've got some other questions. Shona, have you covered all of that?
Right, sorry, I'll move on to
as well as the supplementary. We're following on.
Okay, so obviously be aware of the comments in the annual report of the Chief Inspector of Prisons talking about the financial pressures of the Scottish Prison Service being, I think the word was immense. And one of the issues highlighted was the cost for the service in purchasing additional prisoner places in the two privately run prisons. So I wanted just to ask yourself, Mr Shannon, if you could expand on that and what the implications you think from that are for financial sustainability and being able to resolve some of these wider issues that we've been discussing over the last hour or so.
I don't have the precise figures on how much a prisoner place in a private jail costs, but it is significantly higher than the cost of the public sector prison places. So they had no choice but to effectively purchase an extra 100 places from Kilmarnock Prison, which is one of the private prisons, and that was at a significant financial cost. I or SPS could give you the precise figures on that, but again, the Audit Scotland report that was published last week highlighted that was a kind of unsustainable position going forward against the flat rate budget that they've had for some time, which, as you've pointed out, was a 12.5% reduction in real terms. And so this year, SPS itself has only been able to manage that situation by having to go back to the Scottish Government and effectively say we will not be able to live within our budget, and they've reached an agreement where the Scottish Government will cover the additional cost of those places for this year in Kilmarnock. So I think there was something like a 22 million of additional funding that the Scottish Government has provided this year to help with the pressures on the SPS, including the pay settlement. But the point is, if the budget stays flat, then that's not sustainable.
Okay, that's helpful. Mr. Fairley, anything to add to?
Well, from a trade union perspective, we were always against the private prisons, and actually, I don't want to take this off on a tangent into a different direction, but the involvement of private prisons has been the genesis for a whole number of the problems that, from the prison service point of view, from prison staff's point of view, are where we ended up with in terms of the terms and conditions, environment, staff and complements. They've all had a huge impact over many, many years to the situation we're in, and actually what we're dealing with just now is sometimes just a legacy of some of that. So my position would be more a political point rather than a financial one, if you don't mind.
Okay. Just also, could I get your comments on more generally the effectiveness of recent spending decisions on prison modernisation and improvement, including that of the existing estate? So obviously there's been a focus on security measures to prevent the smuggling of illicit goods, for example, and the timeframes for new prisons. Any comments maybe yourself, Mr. Sun?
So, I mean, we're really pleased from the inspectorate point of view that there's a commitment from the Scottish Government to go ahead with the modernisation of the women's estate and HM Prison Glasgow. That's fantastic news, but both of those can't come soon enough, is the bottom line. I understand that the intention or expectation is that the new women's national facility at Cornton Vale and the two community custody units in Glasgow and Dundee will be in place by, I think it's 2021. I don't think we've got a date yet for when HMP Glasgow will come online. I think they're trying to purchase the site at present. But certainly, having just come out of an inspection at Barlinnie, be in no doubt at all that it is a Victorian prison which is not fit for purpose in a modern prison service, and the sooner we can get a replacement for that, the better.
Okay. Anything to add, Mr.
I would agree, and I think there are probably three prisons that badly need either replaced or removed altogether. One of them being Barlinnie, so that absolutely needs to be replaced. You're holding 1,500 or up to 1,500 of the prisoner population in a prison that is simply just not fit for purpose. The conditions in which staff have been asked to work and prisoners have been held, there's no longer a place for that in 2019, so it needs replaced as a matter of priority. But we're sitting in a position just now where the Scottish Prison Service budget is such that they are cutting the maintenance budget from the capital spend as a means of getting by to deal with the budget they've got. Now, if something was to happen in a place like Barlinnie, due to a maintenance budget being cut and not able to do the kind of infrastructure work that's required in there, I genuinely do not know where we would deal with that inside the Scottish prison system to deal with that kind of prisoner movement. We don't have the capacity to deal with a failure of that magnitude. So it's no small issue that there's a variation between where prisoners have been held and staff are working. Low Moss and Grampian are fantastic examples of good modern prisons, but they sit alongside some of the worst prison conditions anywhere in the UK, and as a priority they need to be replaced.
Okay, thank you.
Just if I could pick up on, you said the terms and conditions in the private prison presented a problem for the SPS. Could you elaborate on that?
From my time in the trade union, which is 25 years, I remember vividly the conversations and the change in the conversations we were having with the employer and the chief executive at the time, in terms of who we would be compared against, and the kind of conversations we were having around terms and conditions, and the private sector were used as the benchmark, or from a trade union language, the stick with which we were beaten with at the time to hold back the terms and conditions, to reduce staff complements, the growth in pay, the terms and conditions that came with the role of a prison officer. The private sector became the competition with which we were measured against constantly. That had a significant impact on the industrial relations and the negotiations that were taking place at the time between us and the employer.
I'm trying to understand then how the private sector could take the capacity of 100. I mean, are they managing to recruit prison officers? Do they not have a shortage? Because they seem to be able to take the to pick up the slack, if you like.
So my trade union don't have recognition rights for the private sector, so I couldn't talk to you in detail about what their arrangements are. One of the things that has always been an issue for us in terms of the private sector is that we never believed they had enough staff in the first place, never mind for the numbers over and above. We didn't believe they were properly staffed for the contract number of 500 in Kilmarnock, and it was those numbers that were being used in the negotiations with us and the employer in the public sector as a means of keeping those numbers down. I can't tell you what their current position is in terms of numbers. We don't have the recognition rates for those two prisons.
I mean, given we've covered, this difficulty of attracting staff, I think it would be interesting to see if there's anything being done in the private sector that could be replicated to make the job more attractive in the SPS generally. Okay, thank you on that. Next one, Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Yes, I'd like to ask you about priorities for future spending. I appreciate this might be a better question to ask the Scottish Prison Service, but I would like your take on it. Would you like funding to deal specifically with issues such as staffing, and you've mentioned the problems with recruitment, which I appreciate, overcrowding, drug use, safety and security, suicide prevention, and the growing ageing prison population. Is there any one area that you would like future spending to go on? Yeah.
So, shall I start? I mean, I think they're all important. In my opinion, the fact that we still have these Victorian prisons, so I think that the investment in the capital estate is the critical one for me. So, I mean, just to re-emphasise what my colleague was saying, that not only is Barlinnie a kind of single point of failure, and we know there are issues around the drainage there that make it a high-risk issue for the SPS, but it has no capacity to cope with further surge in numbers anywhere. So that's a priority, but you've got Inverness that needs replaced, you've got Greenock that needs replaced, you've got Dumfries, bits of Perth. So the whole prison estate is really needing, I mean, it's commendable that the Scottish Government has invested in Grampian and Low Moss, but there's a need to really push on with those. But you're absolutely right to say the other thing that worries us is around older prisoners. So just as an example, in Barlinnie, out of that population of 1,400 prisoners, there was only 5 cells that were suitable for disabled prisoners. Now that is unacceptable in a modern prison service. So, we know with the number of the increase in sex offenders, historical cases being now coming to court, that there's an increasing number of older people coming into jail at a relatively old time, and therefore will stay in prison for a long time as older prisoners. Therefore, I think the SPS does need to look at how it looks after older prisoners, and that for me would be a particular priority.
Thank you. Mr. Fairley?
So, while I wouldn't disagree with a word about the need to invest in the capital spend in the estate, I agree with every bit of that. For me, the priority would be on staff. I think the report that came out last week's made it clear that the only reason the prison service continues to effectively deliver and function is because we've got large numbers of staff working large numbers of extra hours over and above the contract to keep the place going. That is not sustainable, and you're starting to see the the effects and the impacts of that in the sick absence levels, where that 60% growth is coming from staff who are trying their best to come in and put in as many extra hours as they can to cover the rosters. In a frontline service, you can't put the work to the side and pick it up later when people come back. You need every gap in that roster to be covered every time that the gaps appear. That's requiring staff to come in over and above their contract and provide those hours. What's happening is those staff are becoming the new sick absence figures themselves, because it's not sustainable to keep that going for any length of time. So the staff who are in covering those gaps in the roster themselves are going sick, and there's an ever decreasing circle of staff left to pick up those pieces. So for me, the priority has to be that we get a staff complement that matches the prison population. I said last week when this report came out that we need to stop funding the prison service based on the numbers we wish we held and fund them based on the numbers we actually hold. And I think that's where we are just now, if we don't have the staff complement to deal with that prisoner population.
Yeah. So given what you've said about the recruitment problems and just attracting people into the profession as a career, do you have anything to suggest that could help that? You know, what would be your sort of, if there is a magic bullet, what would it be to get more people into the service?
But I think the convener touched on it earlier on, that there is a catch-22 to this. Until you fix some of the things that, to somebody on the outside looking in, stops us looking like an attractive option as a career move, just adding to the salary isn't going to be enough to make this a career move that people are very confident and enthusiastic about joining. It will help the staff who are inside the service. It will indicate and signal to them some recognition of what it is that they're doing to keep the place afloat. But in terms of attracting new people into it, we need to deal with some of the core issues, which is the increase in the prisoner numbers, which is the increase in violence, which is the increase in sick. So until you tackle the core of that, which is far too many prisoners inside our prisons, I'm not sure you're going to be able to tackle the rest of it.
Okay. If I could, sorry, Mr. Sandham.
I mean, I completely agree with all of that, that we need to get the staffing levels right, and I think that's the pressure that the SPS, this flatline budget that this SPS has had for a number of years now, is really drawing out and coming to fruition. I think there are a few other things that would be worth investing if there was money available. So the SPS has agreed to do a pilot on in-cell technology in Pullman on the back of our mental health report. We very much welcome that. But again, the SPS as a whole is way behind England in terms of the number of prisons that have access to in-cell technology. And we know that helps reduce mental health issues and actually takes pressure, therefore, off prison staff. Again, another thing that we've seen in the private prisons is investment in these kiosks where prisoners can kind of order their own appointments, order their own menus. There's a lot of transactional activity that is done by Phil's colleagues that could be removed with greater use of that sort of technology, and I think that would be beneficial to invest there. And again, another one just to mention, we would like to see more use of kind of video links to make the process of having family visits for people who are travelling from afar easier. We think that would help.
I guess you would hope that the new prison estate will have all that included, and that would be
yes.
result in that. That's fine. Okay, thank you.
Supplementary, Liam Caron, Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Convener. In terms of the rehabilitation future funding, and Phil Fairley, you talked earlier about new psychoactive substances and drugs in prison. Now, off the top of my head, I think 17% of prisoners in 2009 tested positive for drugs when they left, and that was up to about 26% last year. Now, if I'm right on that, then the implication is somehow we're not stopping the drugs getting in, or whatever these things are. And that will have a significant impact on the staff and the attractiveness of the job, because it will raise assaults, and it will, anecdotally, I understand the staff are ingesting this stuff sometimes. So what can be done? And specifically, is there something about something called a rapid scan? And should the SPS or the Scottish Government or somebody be investing to deploy that across the estate?
So the thing about the psychoactive substances, the makeup of it, they change the compound of it so regularly that sometimes the normal methods with which we would use to detect drugs coming in, if it's cocaine or heroin or cannabis, the dogs are very, very effective at identifying that kind of thing. They're not quite as effective in terms of identifying psychoactive substance, so we do need other means of doing that. The rapid scan that you've referred to is a great piece of equipment. The difficulty we've got, and this again, this comes down to budget, there are 3 for the whole estate. So we've got 3 of those pieces of equipment that rotate round the service, and it's potluck as to whether you've got one available to you at any given time, and when they're there, they're very effective. But in the prison system, we should have one of those in every single prison. It's not that we've got prisons where psychoactive substances aren't an issue. They're an issue in every single establishment. So we've got a piece of equipment that we know is far more effective than what we've been using up to now. So it requires capital investment to buy those pieces of equipment and stop them coming in.
Thank you.
Fulton.
Thanks again, Convener. Just brief supplementary. Stephen Sandman, just a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned the quite striking figure of the amount of cells available for that's suitable, for disabled prisoners. I just wanted to come back to you on that. Have you made any recommendations to the Scottish Prison Service about how they might invest to drastically improve that figure?
So we will be making recommendations on that. We're at the stage, we've done the field work, so we've been into the Barlinnie, and we're at the stage now where we're pulling our report together. We always give the SPS and the prison itself the opportunity to comment on any kind of factual errors that we may have made, or challenge any of our findings before we publish it. So I'm not really at liberty until we've been through that process to go into full detail, but you can be assured that we will be making recommendations about the need to tackle that issue. And again, it highlights the fact that there are limits, we know, that to what they can do with an old prison like that. It just highlights the fact that we need to invest and bring a new H&P Glasgow on stream as soon as we possibly can.
Okay, thanks for that. And perhaps you can keep the committee updated when you're at a further stage in those discussions.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Concludes our question. Can I thank the witnesses for attending? We'll now suspend for 5 minutes for a change of witnesses and a comfort break. I welcome the witnesses for our second panel, Professor Nancy Laux, Chief Executive of Families Outside, Tom Halpin, Chief Executive of SACRO, Alistair Muir, Deputy Director and Chief Inspector of Violence Reduction Unit, and Sean Duffy, Chief Executive of the WISE Group. We move straight to questions, starting with John Finney.
Indeed, Convener, good morning, panel. I don't know if you were listening to the earlier discussions, but I'd like to ask this panel, as well as I asked the previous one, about the implications for rehabilitation and reintegration, and how the increased prison population is affecting that, please.
The reality is that there are interventions that we know work. The evidence is there, and particularly mentoring as an intervention and in terms of through care support for people reintegrating back into communities. There is no doubt that the pressure in the prison service just now in terms of staff and numbers of people in prison impacts on the ability to do productive work with people while they're in prison, and that has been quite apparent in terms of following it through into reintegration. So just highlighting the point that this has a direct implication for rehabilitation.
Yes, thank you.
We've already seen some of the impact of that in relation to the suspension of the Through Care Support Officer Service, where the officers who are providing a vital role in terms of the transition into the community and support for families alongside that were being taken back into the prison to do other roles to deal with the increasing prison population. And that is a service that was very well evaluated and will be very much missed. Our concern at Families Outside is that we'll see other kind of vulnerable roles go a similar way, the family contact officers being a prime candidate for that, and we really can't afford to see that, not least because things like family contact, which seem not to be related to justice, are actually critical in terms of resettlement of people when they come out of prison.
I'd just like to echo what Tom and Nancy have said there. I think, you know, in addition to that, there's also the ability to support the PSPs that we have in play at the moment. And that's integral. The success of that is integral to the way in which the prison service and the third sector work together in that handover mode. So the more time pressure and time poor the internal cohort of prison officers are, the less effective that handover process can be, that warm handover, that successful journey to reintegration, pre-liberation and post-liberation.
Thank you. Mr. Muir?
Yeah, again, reiterating what the panel have already said, and I guess where the Violence Reduction Unit are looking at is how do we fill that gap that's now been left with through care, and it was there before, not in all prisons was there through care. And later on we'll talk about some of the work that we're trying to do to fill that gap with, again, as already alluded to, the lived experience is crucial in filling that gap, that transition from those who are inmates into the community.
Can I ask then, in relation to through care and the important role it played in reintegration, what discussions were had with any of you in advance of the decision taken to remove the prison officers and put them back into the prison estate?
There was no discussion. We became aware of it at the time the decision was intimated by the Chief Executive in correspondence to us. What didn't come across as a lack of willingness to us, it was the sensitivities of how would that be managed within the prison system themselves. But we've had discussions with them since that, in the intervening period between that intimation when it was actually being affected, which would be about 2+ months later.
No, if you just leave your buttons, they come on automatically. Okay.
Have to press your button by magic, then as soon as you indicate you want to speak, your microphone will go on.
Okay. Just to follow on and build on what Thomas said, you know, there was no prior notice. However, since the decision has been taken, we've been fully involved with discussions about how we fill that void that's been left behind. The third sector and government and support from SPS.
Can I ask how you feel about that? I mean, I understood it to be a partnership arrangement and the vital role that your organisations play in the criminal justice system, particularly with regard to rehabilitation. at the very best, it appears a discourtesy. Mr Halpern.
I've always taken the view that you can't point the finger at the prison service for not being community-facing and then poke it in the eye when it looks out. And so the whole initiative with Through Care support, working with the third sector and integrating those services, was a journey for us all, and we've all worked earnestly in achieving that. And I would say that the relationship built up with the Through Care support officers, a level of trust within the system, and the handshake through the gate to the mentors and community was coming good. Really, it was really effective. And so it is really disappointing that for resourcing reasons that's had to be suspended, as we understand it. And the mentors are stepping into that space as much as they can. It does have resource implications for them, because you have to have the work done in the prison to make that connection before someone returns to community. It's real. So it's absolutely imperative that we have those conversations ongoing. But the fact that, and I can understand that there's operational reasons for keeping things confidential until you're ready to make announcements, etc. But if the third sector is to be a valued partner, not just in the prison service, but across local authorities and Scottish Government, it has to be, there must be a level of trust around privacy in terms of confidentiality, that we may not have the statutory responsibility, but we have a professional and caring responsibility for the people who are in the care of the prison service and who we seek to care for as they return to the community.
Sorry.
If I could just say, it's an area that James was
I
going
do
to concentrate on.
I'll leave it there.
And if there's anything not answered, you can come in as supplementary. Okay. James Kelly.
Thank you, Convener. I think you've all made really valid points in terms of the benefits of the Through Care service, in terms of support for prisoners being released into the community and also helping to reduce reoffending. And obviously it's regrettable that the service has been suspended. Just in terms of how we move forward, it was announced as a temporary suspension. In terms of the discussions that you've had, has there any indication been given that the 42 officers that are involved in Through Care will be reintroduced at some point, or has the focus of the discussion been on alternative arrangements?
From the discussions that I've been involved in, they've been centred more on the people who require the support rather than the circumstances in the background. You know, the public social partnership model that we have through Shine and New Routes is available to flex and to support that additional capacity within reason. So our focus has been entirely on the support required to fill that interim solution. We're certainly not across what's happening within SPS in a longer term.
There is no indication to us yet of an expected date when that would be reintroduced. If it will be reintroduced, obviously there's operational circumstances that need to be taken in consideration, but we are working on the basis that that support is no longer there, and how do we make sure that support is provided to people who need it. What I would say is that these people, the picture painted of someone maybe posing significant risk or whatever, these are very vulnerable people, people whose circumstances, without getting into it again, has caused them a life journey that we would not wish for ourselves. And the consistency of support and that being taken away just mirrors what they've experienced in their life if we give something and then stop providing it. So it's really important just now we focus on the needs of these people.
Okay. Yes, I wanted to ask Professor Laux if you could maybe highlight how the withdrawal of this, the temporary withdrawal, has affected families and children, women and children specifically.
Yeah, we do have a number of our staff who've worked very closely with the Through Care support officers. We don't have any kind of service level agreement. We don't really see any funding on the back of it, but it has made our jobs much more difficult because we don't have that connection. We don't have the issues that families are facing highlighted to us as readily. A lot of the people who are supported through this scheme would otherwise be engaging in voluntary support in the community, often which they never engaged with. So it's been a loss, certainly for us, in terms of reaching out to families that we would that we otherwise don't have access to.
And just on that, I mean, is there a way you can reach out to them in any way or form? Is there any way, although the referrals, if you like, have been stopped, is there any way you know how you can identify women and families who need help?
We do that already through things like the public social partnership that Sean discussed, and much of it depends on the future discussions there and what types of ways that the PSP as a whole can address the gap that's been left on the back of that, because we are part of that PSP and can support families in that way. What we don't know is how many families that were supported through care support officers perhaps wouldn't be eligible for support through the PSP or don't have that support in their area.
Okay, thank you.
John Finney, supplementary.
Thank you, Convener. It was to pick up, if I understood correctly, the previous panel told us that this was about resource, this was about individuals to work on the prison estate. It wasn't about money. They had been offered money by the Scottish Government. Can I ask, given that you'd been asked perhaps to fill the void, I know, and I hear Mr Halpin that it's not simply just taking over, has there been any additional money directed in your direction as a result of this suspension of the through care?
The straight answer to that at the moment is no. We have the allocation we have within the public social partnership, the one that I lead and the collaboration which we're all involved in, delivers way in excess of what the service level agreement was every year, and the discretionary effort from these mentors is to be commended. And so the one thing that's been demonstrated by the public social partnership is the flexibility and responsiveness of that service.
Just to build on what Tom said, equally the male-focused PSP, the WISE Group leads with its valued partners. What we've managed to do, working with the partners and with government, is look at what additional headroom we can create within the existing funding arrangement that we have, and on a value for money case. And that's where we're stepping in with our partners to fill that void and absorb as much as we possibly can in terms of referrals in the absence of the through care support service.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I ask, the committee has visited the WISE Group. We've heard from Serco on numerous occasions, and we're totally aware, acutely aware, of just how important through care is and how that can help make sure there isn't reoffending and provide that second chance for people to reintegrate into society. So given this current situation, short-term situation, is there a case that the role of WISE Group and people like Serco could be extended to start working in the prison before release in a short term to do this, as well as the main role that you do just now, which is picking up from where the prison left off and supporting prisoners when they are released? Could I have a view on that?
Yeah. Certainly, the way in which the PSP operates at the moment is we are actually in prison 6 months pre-liberation and then 6 months post-liberation. Yeah. So that is in effect at the moment. I mean, there's certainly things that we could look to extend. I mean, certainly the flexibility to make that potentially 18 months rather than 12 months. So it's 12 months post-liberation, 6 months pre-liberation. Would certainly be welcome.
And is that working okay just now? There's no interruption because of the shortage of staff?
No. There's no interruption. It's still both programmes still work to a very high level. I think the only concern we have, and it's one that we must be alive to, is that the resourcing challenges within the SPS estate could potentially impact on that partnership approach inside prison. And you've got the warm handover requirement that we have to be acutely aware that may be impacted. So they have the
accommodation to facilitate you going in there?
Yes, and also that relationship in terms of, bear in mind, when our mentors enter the prison estate, we're there accompanied by an SPS member of staff. And if they're under other time pressures, that may be impacted upon, so we've just got to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do the other panellists have any view on that particular suggestion?
There's more than one model for public social partnerships, and that's been one of its strengths, and it includes the public social partnership within Low Moss Prison, where third sector staff are embedded in the halls with SPS staff and provide mentoring support through the gate as well. So the issue that you raise, can the third sector work inside prisons? The answer to that is absolutely yes, and there's loads of evidence of that.
I was just wondering an extension of the role for this kind of through care that you'll be starting in prison and going on. If the prison officers, they don't have the physical numbers to do it just now to try and ensure it gone, it would mean resourcing the third sector more to do it, but at least it would be going on, it would be a preventative spend.
I think as well, sorry. I think as well as you know, on top of what Tom said, is that continuity of relationship from pre-liberation to post-liberation is hugely important to the success of that relationship itself, and that's been proven through the PSP models. There isn't a handing of the baton between people. There's a relationship and a trust built up pre-liberation that's carried post-liberation.
Yeah, I understand that. That's helpful. Fulton.
Good morning, panel. It's following on from Rona Mackay's points and the discussion around through care. I think there's quite a lot of evidence around the benefits of family contact with prisoners in terms of their own health and also wider rehabilitation goals. Perhaps yourself first, Professor Lux. I know you talked there a wee bit about through care and your interaction with that, but can you talk a wee bit about the availability of services generally to promote family contact?
Rehabilitative services in the community, sorry, or just for clarification?
Well, both, I suppose, but more when folk are still in custody.
Yeah, one of the things that we find, obviously we work with the families specifically and not with the people who are in prison, but what we're finding is that families really struggle with access, depending on where they're from, depending on how well things are funded. They have real concerns about what happens when people come out of prison if they don't have that support to connect with, particularly looking at services dealing with addiction, services supporting mental health. And there is a real concern there, particularly if there are waiting lists or if they're not from a particularly well supported urban area. If you're in Glasgow, it's much easier perhaps than if you're in Lanarkshire, where I live. So there is a real concern there, and that concern obviously weighs on the families who are wanting to make sure that their family member stays out of prison and are often really struggling to make sure that support is available, and that support reflects on the support they receive themselves as well.
We heard in the last panel, I don't know if you caught any of it, just some of the pressures that the prison service are under just now in terms of staffing and other factors. But we also heard that I think we need to find ways in order to improve outcomes for prisoners, and that would have an effect on the staffing situation as well. How much do you think family contact's prioritised by the prison service in terms of reaching its goals?
Yeah. I think it's prioritised in theory. I think in practice we see things that their priority is focused on dealing with overcrowding and so on. And so we are seeing a reduction in attention to family contact, even though family contact is absolutely critical in terms of providing a successful resettlement, because family contact makes sure that people have a place to live, they have financial support, social support, links to employment, all sorts of things that simply don't exist if you don't have that same support waiting for you outside. So that is a real problem if you're talking about restricting access to visits, for example. If your staff are overpressed, they're not going to be able to support that in the same way. I mentioned the role of the family contact officers, which are incredibly important in terms of supporting those links between people in prison and their families. And if they're pulled away from their duties to support absences in the residential staff, that's not going to be there in the same way. We also have a number of innovations that are coming in that are available, things like links for video visits, which the prisons aren't really able to extend in a way that we would perhaps see if they had more time to focus on that, because these are seen as very important links, important ways of supporting those ties without families necessarily having to travel to the prisons. For that. So we're seeing a lot of gaps there, and what we are seeing as well is recognition within other jurisdictions, for example in England and Wales, which following Lord Farmer's reports into men and women actually requires each prison to have a family plan and to report on that plan annually, despite the pressures that they're facing, similar to the ones we have up here. So I would like to see more of a focus on that, because it is absolutely critical to people's success once they leave prison.
Do any of the other panellists have a view on the availability of supports promoting family contact, and how your own services can or are involved in that?
The one service that SACRO provides, and we very much partner with Nancy and colleagues, Families Outside, is around the travel service to keep the connection between families. Just give you the scenario of a mum and her 3 kids and trying to take them with a number of buses to a place that's not located in a very accessible place to maintain that contact. It's very, very difficult. And so funding for a service like that really is the Cinderella service. And you know, we've struggled to keep that going over the years. And even things like bureaucracy kicks in, you know, the ability, how much they could reclaim in the travel expenses was more than halved in cost cutting, so they weren't even to get the money back then. And then they changed the rules that who could apply for that. Therefore, so how do you tell someone in that situation to apply for this expense and then hand it over to us? You know,
who's they? Sorry,
the families of prisoners. So I apologise.
No, so you said that they changed the rules about how much you could apply.
Well, it was, you know, it's through the arrangements for expenses for visiting someone in prison. You know, so it goes back to allowances, etc.
Okay.
Yeah, there's another, if I may, just on down in Kilmarnock Prison, which is a private prison that doesn't have through care, I understand, and it can be corrected in that one. There's a project between SACRO and ourselves at the Violence Reduction Unit, and it's really using the term community navigators. So these will be people from SACRO, funded through the VRU grant, and they're really looking at that. We've talked about consistency, and that's one of the key things that's sometimes missing, is that key person who can do that through care, but actually into the community and can be a link with the family as well, because that's a huge part of the rehabilitation of anybody back into their own communities, not just with housing but work, but actually back into families and integration. So that's coming on soon, and that's just one of the kind of interventions we're looking at for through the lens of the public health. Try it small, the public health approach, try it small and then build it up. If it works there, then let's look at scaling it.
Yeah, just to echo my colleagues here, Families Outside are part of the New Routes PSP, and it's they're a valued member of that. And you know, we certainly know from working with the customers that we do work with that family contact and support and reintegration is of significant importance to the rehabilitation journey. So it's certainly something that we support.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you. Yeah, just Professor Loucks, if I may, I'd like to take you back to these virtual visits that Fulton McGregor was asking about, because I can see how important that would be for someone like HMP Grampian. And I think there's something from SPS own documentation that talks about how important family relationships are in preventing reoffending. So if that's right, where are we on these virtual visits? What is SPS' view of this? And as far as you're aware, are they able to resource it?
Yeah. It is a continued frustration. It's something we've been trying to get from the SPS for a while in terms of having an IT strategy, which is not yet come to fruition. They are experimenting with some areas. For example, HMP Inverness has a series of virtual visits that they operate from the Prison Visitor Centre that's run by Action for Children, and Families Outside assists with that. Apex also has a contract with the Scottish Prison Service based in Aberdeen to provide video links for visits within 5 prisons. This came about after the young people were removed from Grampian and made sure that families could keep contact. So there is a degree of commitment there. What we don't see is universal coverage or an intention to evaluate or to expand this work, which was a huge frustration. We're seeing very good examples of where video visits work very well. For example, all 3 prisons in Northern Ireland use them. Park Prison in Wales uses them. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child recommended video visits as a way of supplementing face-to-face visits for children. They recommended that in 2012. But the reality we see is, just an example a colleague of mine sent to me this morning, we're supporting a family in the islands who had to apply for assisted prison visits. I think it's called the Family Support Service now, but had to apply for travel support to visit her partner in Grampian. She had to pay it up front, but then was reimbursed £369 for travel, hire car and accommodation for the visit. It took her 3 days to visit. This is travelling with a child who's not quite a year old. She can only afford to do this about once every 6 months. The child obviously can't speak on the phone yet, can't read or write letters, but a video link would actually be really, really helpful. And the local authority that she was in agreed to support her with this, but the prison wouldn't accommodate it. So it's a real frustration that we're seeing an inconsistency, I think, in the degree of support they're willing to provide, or able to provide, perhaps is a better phrase.
Clarify for me, if you would, please, if I've misunderstood something. So the cost of that visit, the £369, I think you said, the individual availing himself and it can claim that back from some state body. Presumably a virtual conference would cost a fraction of £369.
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Liam McCarthy.
Following up Liam Kerr's line of questioning, apologies for my late arrival due to flight delays. This is an issue I've picked up with Prison Service previously, and in a sense the answer to the question was that this is available. I suppose I'm guilty of not asking the right question. What are the reasons that are put forward for not facilitating that sort of contact? As Liam Kerr's identified, the cost to the service as a whole is dramatically less than it would be for funding travel from the islands, for example.
It's a very good question, because we get different responses when we ask. Often we'll see things like it's not, they don't have the staff to facilitate a video visit, often because they're done through special video links similar to a court video link would be done. There are ways around this, certainly in terms of how visits operate. So the visits in Park Prison, for example, were part of the normal visits in a prison visiting room alongside face-to-face visits, so they didn't require any additional staff for that. They were managed in the same way. The ones in Northern Ireland, depending on the privilege level of the person in prison, they can actually take a laptop into their cell to do this. There's a video visit link in Tasmania that actually relies entirely on unpaid volunteers. So there are different ways of managing this. So I just feel it needs the time and the funding perhaps to explore what this might look like.
And so is it the case that in each prison where this is available, and I'm assuming it's available potentially available across the estate, is it always SPS staff that would be required to be present during the course of a video conference, or is it external staff that could provide that supportive oversight role?
It's certainly not a requirement for SPS staff to be part of it. Again, the one in Inverness is run by Action for Children. The one in Aberdeen is run through Apex. The ones in the staff in the prisons who are supporting the person in prison to take part in these, it is prison staff who facilitate that. Whether that's a requirement, I don't know.
Right. And is the availability in the likes of Inverness and Aberdeen therefore greater than it is in other prisons from your experience?
It depends on, it has to work both ways. So, for example, Inverness has the capacity to link with any prison in Scotland. Whether the receiving prison actually has the capacity on the other end to return the favour, it does tend to vary. Aberdeen, the service in Aberdeen is only connected with 5 prisons. So in theory, every prison is set up to facilitate this. In practice, we're seeing very different results.
But in a sense, actually, the connection for certainly those living in the islands would potentially need to be either a local authority venue or some external venue, external to the prison estate itself. And are there things that could be done that would enable that to happen more routinely than appears to be the case at the moment?
That's how it's set up in Scotland. Again, in Park Prison, they can be done from your home. They don't need necessarily a central local authority position to do that. It depends very much on the kind of security assurances that can be given. But there are certainly the models in Park Prison and in Northern Ireland and in Tasmania are all kind of individual. In Tasmania, for example, they use individual iPads and iPhones to provide that service.
That's helpful, thanks.
Did you have another question, Liam?
Do you want me to follow up now? Yeah, I think we've focused quite understandably on the issue in relation to those who are transitioning from the prison estate back into the community. But I suppose equally important to the debate about where resources are placed is the efforts that are made to avoid individuals coming into contact with the criminal justice system in the first instance. I mean, this will be, I'm sure, that an issue in which you all have a view. I don't know whether, Mr Muir, it's particularly pertinent to your organisation, but could maybe tell the committee about the resources that are currently available and whether or not they are sufficient to meet the, I think, the aspirations the government this committee would have in terms of trying to reduce the occasions where individuals do end up finding themselves within the criminal justice system.
I mean, prevention is key. That's the kind of language that most of us are speaking. Is how do we reduce? How do we stop recidivism? And we've got things that go back right down to education. We've got projects that are now in 30 of the 32 local authorities called Mentors in Violence Prevention. And really, it's kind of it's looking at gender-based violence, but it's looking right across violence, but right at the kind of the core issues of it, from bullying to controlling behaviour, sexting, relative stuff that the young people are dealing with. And it's a peer-to-peer education programme, and it's been evaluated very, very well, hence the reason it's spread right across the local authority area. So it's really challenging. It's giving young people permission to challenge others on a bystander approach. So if they see inappropriate behaviour, whatever that may look like, they're kind of equipped and confident, sufficiently confident to challenge that behaviour. So it's really starting right at the bottom of where we are with young people. There's many other projects we've got. Three of us spent a joyful summer Edinburgh Military Tattoo with 10 young people who have convictions. They're part of the support team at the Edinburgh Military Tattoo. We have the joy of sleeping in barracks with them 24 hours a day. But these 10 young men have never had structures in their lives. They've never had role models. They've really just, they're the almost forgotten people who cannot get onto a job market because of their convictions, the level of convictions. So we're seeing it's slow work, it's hard work. But again, it's starting small, and can this work? Can it be evidenced to work? Can it be evaluated to work? And then let's see where that goes from here. So we've had some from that group into full-time employment since then, which is not just about them, it's the ripple of them into their families, it's into their communities, and it's into, they're actually paying members who smile and say, I'm paying tax now. Never seen anybody do that. So, you know, whereas they were a drain, they're now not. We've also got another project that's been running for a couple of years called Street and Arrow, which is taking young trainees, again, these same cohort of young men and women, and giving them a year's work on a training programme, and it happens to be catering. But we again teach them all these skills about, you know, how to be the adults they want to be, how they want to be the humans they want to be and they were meant to be. And again, it's success results, but it's intense. It takes funding, and it's funding from different agencies, and we're discussing with others in the panel about that as well. So there's quite a number of different areas that we really believe in prevention. We want the prison population to come down, as most, I would agree, want it to come down. So we've got quite a lot of different navigator programmes. Mentoring is lived experiences, as I said at the outset, huge. That's the authenticity and the credibility.
And just before I invite others to come in on this, I mean, is the experience that at a time where budgets have been under more pressure, both at national, local level, that those sorts of programmes have survived intact? Because I think everybody accepts that the prevention ultimately is a more cost-effective way of dealing with this. But actually, you've still got to deal with the consequences of criminal behaviour, and therefore the resources then tend to attract to that sort of response rather than the preventative work. I mean, what has been the experience over recent years of what's happened to budgets to support those sorts of initiatives? So,
within the PSP structure, I'm sure my colleagues will agree that the funding that we receive has remained flat over the 7 years of its existence, and the need for it has only increased. So that's something that we would suggest that's looked at. As well as that flat funding, I mean, one of the things that would help the sector be more impactful, even more impactful than it currently is looking at the structure of multi-year funding, and not, dare I say it, bumping along year after year after year. Because what that does is it disincentivises our organisations and our colleagues to commit and to provide long-term planning and investment for longer-term impact. Yeah, and just to go back before we move on the stuff that Alistair picked up, when you mentioned about prevention, the PSP model that we have in place at the moment through New Routes, we've actually taken that model and we're proposing to apply it to areas where S4, S5 and S6 pupils. And we've worked with some quite forward-thinking area commanders in Police Scotland to develop programmes in that area. And we have a proposal under consideration at the moment within the public sector about how can we do that in a broad sense across Greater Glasgow. So what we have collectively is we have a model that works. It's been proven, it's understood through stakeholders, it's settled in, it's been invested in, it's been evidenced as working, and it's got the opportunity, as Tom mentioned, through it being flexible and adaptable to look at other areas of issue, whether it be in prevention or community-based support.
Yeah. Scotland's at a juncture, in my view. We know what works. You know what works. It's been evidenced, and we know the reality. I suspect the reason you ask the question about preventative spend is that you have a real suspicion it's not there. And the reality is that preventative spend, there's a huge gap between the rhetoric about prevention and the resourcing of it, and virtually discretionary spend on innovation and prevention has disappeared at the moment. You know, it's the core business that you would see coming through around through care, etc. and the work that the Violence Reduction Unit is doing is one of the gems that we have. It allows some seeds to grow, but there's some public funding in there. It's not the broader third sector in that sense. We know what works, but are we going to do it differently and reflect where we are today? And that's the challenge that we all have. We've heard today from the Prison Officers Association about the pressure on staff and how they're restricting what they can do now. We've heard about the numbers rising. A decade of rhetoric about moving people out of prison, and we've got 100 less than we had at the peak. And so the big thing is about what happened with all the work to stop people going in. So the funding around bail supervision disappeared. It wasn't just about preventative spend, it was significant spend about stopping people going in. People who would be held in remand. We had examples of initiatives with sheriff principals supporting it. And we knew, and again, we knew it worked. You know, in one court, 30 women in a year who were, it wasn't they might go to prison. These were people at the stage in the proceedings were called in, they were heading for remand, and we wrapped around them with mentoring support, and actually the statutory, the court social workers working closely with them as well. 25 of those 30 women who were known to be failing successfully complied. A lot of people who go in remand go there not because they commit crime, they go because they can't comply with the conditions of bail, and that support takes people out. So there's something here around what about police diversion from prosecution, never mind alternatives to prison. These systems up and down the country, when cuts had to be made, were the low-hanging fruit. And those were our core services. And we've seen huge reduction in that spend in Scotland. And the final thing I would say about this is 8,300, call it that, in our prisons today. And what we're going to do about it. But there's 300 less young people in that number because the whole systems approach was applied to take people out of that system. And youth offending hasn't gone through the roof. People are not less safe because of that. So we can do it differently, but we have to be we have to be big in not just our ambition and our rhetoric, but in what we actually do about system change. And I think that's a real challenge here.
Finished? Yeah. Rona, supplementary.
Convener. Yes, I just wanted to ask, that's all really interesting. I wanted to ask particularly Professor Laux what impact the proposed production against short sentences would have on, well, everybody, but for women, many of whom are serving less than a year.
I think the prevention against presumption against short-term sentences is extremely important in terms of particularly looking at women's sentencing and the the number of women who have been sentenced to less than 12 months going into prison. So it will prevent the throughput, the sort of churn of people going through prison, and that, certainly from a family's perspective, is incredibly disruptive, regardless of whether it's a week on remand or 2 months serving a sentence for shoplifting or something. These are the types of things that I welcome the presumption against short sentences. What I'm concerned about is what support is available in the community to make sure that the people who are sentenced to a community measure instead actually can comply with those measures. Because the risk is that they'll end up going into prison by the back door by default of their community penalty. So that's where we need to, my view is that's where we really need to concentrate, is making sure that support is available in the community to make those community measures work.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Build on again what Nancy said. We're certainly fully in support of the presumption against short-term sentencing. Again, touching on what Tom said, is I think it's there's an element of about giving the sheriffs who are in action at the moment trust, and there is a credible alternative. And the credible alternative sometimes requires, and most often actually requires, a better and closer working relationship between criminal justice social work and the third sector. I think that's really important, because sometimes sheriffs are either unaware of a community alternative and they lack confidence in it. Maybe someone's untried. The individuals, they may not have the confidence that that individual is going to comply. The criminal justice social work professionals are under such time pressure that they potentially don't have the time to engage with the individual in the manner and depth in which they require to give them that safety. And sheriffs may just sometimes resort to remand where that there's apparently insufficient support available. So there's definitely a confidence job with the sheriffs and the sheriff's network in terms of how criminal justice social work and the third sector could work complementary to provide the necessary support for those customers.
Yeah. Thank you.
In terms of preventative violence reduction, you mentioned the Mentors in Violence programme, Alistair, and the clerks, I think, have asked for an evaluation of that so the committee can see it. You also mentioned another programme with training skills. What was that name?
There's a number of community navigators.
Yeah.
One down in Kilmarnock, is that the one?
I think you said another one, I don't know, Street something?
Oh, sorry, Street Narrow, yes.
Street Narrow.
Yes.
It would be helpful if we could get the evaluation of that too when it's complete. Thank you. The panel will be aware that the Auditor General's findings make pretty grim reading, 2018-2019. And, the comment is basically that the service faces a combination of severe pressures on many fronts, and this poses a threat to the operational safety, effectiveness and financial stability. Now, we've covered preventative spend, we've covered remand, the pressures on that. Is there anything else that you can offer today that would try and address these huge problems that seem to be facing our prisons? Who'd like to take that one? Nancy.
Actually, but is recognising that the Scottish Government has in the past looked very favourably on Scandinavian models. And one of the things that we're seeing in countries like Sweden is actually legislation in place that restricts, prisons are not allowed to be overcrowded. There is actually a legislative regulation that says you cannot have an overcrowded prison. Now, there are another number of ways of mechanisms to control that, and whether that means that if someone goes in, someone has to come out. Some of the things that they do in places like Sweden is to have a waiting list to go in, or weekend prisons and that sort of thing. Those are things I'm not quite as fond of in the idea that it suggests that some people are not so dangerous that they can't remain in the community, that they're going into prison anyway. But I think there is merit in looking at how we use prisons and whether we can actually I think some of the recommendations we've seen in the past, particularly looking at the McLeish Commission years ago, is looking at capping the number of people in prison. It's looking at what are our priorities for justice in Scotland. Do we want to spend it on on prison and have a kind of never-ending supply of people going in, or do we want to look at ways of preventing people from going in and ways of keeping people out?
So maybe a wider research of how other countries manage their prison population is helpful. Anyone else, any suggestions just now? You know, we had this debate earlier on about things that could be looked at, whether that's the role of the prison officer just now, if that's not able to cope with the education and purposeful activity. Is there a way around that? Anything else you can suggest? And I'm aware that, as Liam MacArthur has raised, funding and the 3-year cycle, which we've gone on about forever, is an issue for voluntary services. A lot of money is wasted by just having to plan every year, all the administrative costs, that it seems a bit of a no-brainer. So I suppose this is an opportunity, just as we wind up this session, to give you the chance. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the committee on this particular subject?
I would just like to reiterate something rather than an additional point. You know, the cost benefits are clear from the services that the third sector provide. You know, we're averaging £1,700 per person in terms of operating the mentoring through the PSP. And in the Auditor General's report last week, you're seeing that incarceration costs over £35,000 per annum. That's a stark contrast in terms of those financial figures. We have a situation where, through the New Routes PSP, you've got evidence that only 9.7% of those that are worked with through that PSP return to prison within the first year. You know, so there are clear statistics that point to this model, this proven, established model, invested in model, being able to have dramatic impacts on the more out, fewer in approach that we need to adopt, because clearly we've got a reducing crime rate, but we've got an increasing prison population. It's obvious where we need to apply our focus and support.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Mr Halpin.
The points are well made. The issue for me is that you have to look at the whole system. Mm-hmm. You cannot just look at... It's a conundrum. Where do you put the money when there's not enough to go around? We all understand that. But if you only put the sticking plaster on the bit that's in front of you today, the wound won't heal.
Yeah. Mr Muir?
Yeah, just maybe a couple of points of hope in here. One project we're doing in Low Moss is resilience work. So we've got a psychodynamic counsellor and somebody with lived experience working with groups of inmates, trying to build their resilience through group work. And this is all about reducing violence within, inter-violence within the prison population and against, obviously, the SPS staff. And the plan is to be self-sustaining. The cost is not on SPS. And it's just it's kind of incubation just now. But again, it's trying to reduce the levels of anxiety and let people deal with their trauma in different ways. Another one is, which again is perhaps hope, and it's a lady approached us with having bought a service bus, an ex-service bus for £1, and said, what do we do with it in the criminal justice system? It's now the governor in Saughton, Edinburgh, is totally on board here, and the inmates are gutting that bus. They're rebuilding it with youth music at the back, taking the services to communities in the middle, and then a hairdresser and other bits and pieces. And that bus is going out to the communities. So it's prisoners are getting a purpose. It's costing the prison service nothing other than opening gates for us to go in and out. But it's a really positive something that's happening, and the prisoners are totally engaged by it, and it's going to serve the community. When it's taking the services a lot wider there. And the idea is it's preventing the next, another method of looking differently at preventing the next coming through the doors of the prisons.
To look at some innovative ideas like that. And finally, last one.
Raise one final point just in relation to preventative spend. I think preventative spend needs to look beyond justice into things like health, housing, addressing issues of poverty, for example. And we do have examples. The prison visitor centres that are across Scotland are actually funded across sectors. So they're funded through justice, through children and families, and through health. And it's looking at those joint approaches, so we're making sure that people are supported not to go into prison, but also supported when they come out, so they're not having to have waiting lists to have substance misuse treatment, or waiting lists to go into mental health services that they need. And it's something we need to look much more broadly than justice itself.
So a holistic approach,
yes,
and joined up thinking. Can I thank you all very much for what's been a very worthwhile evidence session, and we now suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave. Agenda item 6 is feedback from the Justice Subcommittee on Policing on its meeting of 12 September 2019. I refer members to paper 4, which is a paper by the clerks. Following the verbal report, there will be an opportunity for a brief comment or questions, and I invite John Finney to provide that feedback.
Thank you, Convener. As you say, the committee has a feedback note in its papers about the most recent meeting, and that meeting was on the 12th of September, when we took evidence from Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority on capital funding for the police service. This forms part of the subcommittee's pre-budget scrutiny of the 2020-21 draft budget. Police Scotland told the subcommittee that capital investment was at the minimum required to meet health and safety standards, which means it is putting, their words, band-aids on its estate instead of addressing shortfalls. They told the subcommittee that they were struggling to keep the estate, fleet and ICT working. The SPA confirmed that it is likely that more police stations will need to be temporarily closed for refurbishment to address health and safety requirements. Both the SPA and Police Scotland have made it clear to the Cabinet Secretary for Justice that this situation is not sustainable. The subcommittee heard that Police Scotland will have to reduce police officer numbers by 750 after Brexit pressures have passed, as this is the only way for the police service to meet its deficit reduction target and operating within the funding that's been provided. Police officer numbers were described as, quote, the last resort, but now an inevitability, so there's nowhere else that savings can be made. The subcommittee heard of their words, capacity creation work that Police Scotland is undertaking, which assessed how police officers could work more efficiently and effectively. However, the witnesses were unable to provide details of any similar exercises undertaken for chief officers or the number of police officers who continue to backfill staff posts. The next meeting of the subcommittee will take place on Thursday, 3rd October, when it will take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice on the police capital budget.
Thank you very much. Do members have any comments or questions? Okay. That being the case, agenda item, thank you for the report, John. Agenda item 7 is consideration of the membership of the subcommittee on policing. I refer members to paper 5, which is a paper by the clerks. In recent weeks, Daniel Johnson has resigned from the committee and subcommittee, and it's proposed he is to be replaced by James Kelly. Additionally, Stuart Stevenson has resigned from the subcommittee, and it's proposed he is to be replaced by Jenny Gilruth. Do members have any comments on these changes? No. Therefore, our members agreed that James Kelly and Jenny Gilruth are to be the new members of the subcommittee, and that I will write to the Parliamentary Bureau accordingly. Agreed? Right, thank you for that. That concludes the public part of today's meeting. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, 24th of September, when we'll be taking evidence on the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner's Bill. We now move into private session. And the public gallery has cleared.